The smoke rose every morning from the hillside east of Havenwood, thin and gray against the winter sky rising from frozen grass like the breath of something buried alive. There was no cabin, no barn, no structure of any kind that human eyes could find. Just that single thread of smoke, patient and deliberate climbing toward clouds that promised nothing good. Councilman Desmond Pruitt had searched that hillside 4 times. He was not a man who accepted mysteries. He was a man who owned the feed store, the lumber yard, and 3 of the 6 buildings on Havenwood's main street. He was a man who had served on the town council for 11 years without a single vote cast against him. He was a man who believed with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been truly wrong about anything that mattered. That the world organized itself according to his understanding of it. The smoke did not organize itself according to his understanding. On the 4th search in the gray cold of a December morning, Pruitt led 12 men up that hillside. They fanned out across the frozen grass, prodding the ground with walking sticks, looking for any seam or gap that might explain what they were seeing. They walked in lines. They walked in circles. They called out to each other across the wind. They found nothing. At one point, Pruitt stopped walking. He stood very still on a flat section of the hill maybe 30 yards from the crest, and looked out across the Dakota prairie, spreading south and west toward a horizon so flat it looked like the edge of the world. The wind cut through his coat. His boots crunched on frost-stiffened grass. Beneath his feet, if he had known where to listen, he might have heard the faint creak of timber, the soft draw of air through a carefully designed flue, the quiet turn of a page. He heard nothing. He stood there for nearly 4 minutes. Then he turned and walked back down the hill with the tight-jawed expression of a man whose certainty had met something it could not explain, and who had decided, as such men often do, that the explanation must simply be that there was nothing to explain. "She's dead," he told the men gathered around him, his breath coming in white clouds. "Froze out there somewhere in October. The smoke is some kind of natural occurrence. Gas escaping from the ground. It happens in this territory." He looked at the hillside one final time, jaw-set, eyes narrow. The girl is gone. He was wrong about that. Solveig Aldred was 15 feet below Desmond Pruitt's boots, lying on a narrow bed built into the earthen wall. A wool blanket pulled to her chin. A tallow candle burning on the shelf above her head. She was reading the last 30 pages of the only book she owned. A Norwegian Bible her father had carried across the Atlantic when she was 3 years old, its cover worn smooth as riverstone by decades of handling. She could hear Pruitt's boots on the packed earth above her. She could hear the muffled voices of the men with him calling back and forth in the cold. She did not move. She had learned in the months since October that stillness was its own kind of power. But to understand what Solveig Aldred built beneath that Dakota hillside, and why she built it, and what it would cost the town of Havenwood to have laughed at her for building it, you have to go back 4 months to a September afternoon that smelled of turned earth and grief, when a 17-year-old girl stood at the edge of her father's homestead with nothing but the clothes on her back and the knowledge inside her head. The knowledge, as it turned out, was enough. Arvid Aldred had come to Dakota Territory from the Telemark region of Norway in 1869, the year Solveig was born. He had been 23 years old, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements, with hands that seemed designed by nature for hard work and pale blue eyes that read weather the way other men read newspapers. He had filed his homestead claim on 160 acres of rolling grassland, 12 miles south of what would eventually become Havenwood, built a 2-room sod house in his first summer, and proceeded to make that land produce through sheer patient stubbornness. He raised Solveig alone from the time she was 6, after her mother died of a fever that swept through the territory in 1875. He did not remarry until Solveig was 14, and when he did, people who knew him well thought it was a mistake. Arvid Aldred was a careful man in most things. In the matter of Maren Dalgard, he was not careful at all. Maren was handsome, organized, and spoke well in company. She managed the homestead's accounts with precision and kept the house in an order that Arvid, who had raised a daughter in comfortable disorder, found vaguely impressive. What Arvid did not see, or perhaps chose not to see, was the way Maren looked at Solveig when she thought no one was watching. Not with cruelty exactly, with calculation. The way a person looks at a problem that has not yet required solving. Arvid died in September of 1886, thrown from a horse that spooked at a rattlesnake crossing the South Trail. He was found 3 hours later by a neighboring farmer. He was 40 years old. He died without debts, without enemies, and without having filed proper documentation on 30 acres of rough hillside land adjacent to his main claim land. He had never bothered to register because he considered it worthless, too rocky for crops, too exposed for grazing. Good for nothing, he had always thought, but the long view it offered of the surrounding prairie. Maren moved with impressive speed. 3 days after the funeral, before the grief had even settled into something Solveig could name. Maren sat down across from her at the kitchen table and spread out a document that a lawyer from Bismarck had apparently prepared some weeks before Arvid's death. The homestead, the document explained, passed to the surviving spouse under Dakota territorial law. Solveig, as a stepdaughter with no blood claim and no legal standing, had no inheritance rights. "This is your father's house," Maren said. Her voice was not unkind. It was simply final, the way a closing door is final, the way a winter freeze is final. "It is mine now. You are not my daughter. You are not my responsibility." She folded the document with practiced care and tucked it back into its envelope. "You'll need to go." Solveig sat at that table for a long moment. She was 17 years old. She had nowhere to go. She had $3.40 in a tobacco tin under her bed, a winter coat that had belonged to her mother, and the Norwegian Bible from her father's shelf above the door. She looked at Maren's face and understood with the particular clarity that sometimes comes to young people in the worst moments of their lives, that there was nothing to argue. The document was real. The law was real. Maren had planned this with the patience of someone who had always intended to arrive at exactly this outcome, and there was no appeal available to a girl without money, without family, and without the kind of standing that men like Councilman Pruitt paid attention to. She packed what she could carry in 20 minutes. She walked out of the house where she had been born into a September afternoon that was turning cold at its edges, the way September does in Dakota when it is preparing to become something harder. And she did not look back. The town of Havenwood watched her come. She walked the 12 miles from the homestead in 4 hours, arriving on the main street in early afternoon, with a canvas pack on her back and a face that showed nothing at all. People who saw her understood immediately what had happened. Word traveled fast in a town of 300 people, and the news about Marin Aldred's legal arrangements had apparently been traveling for some time before the funeral made them relevant. Councilman Desmond Pruitt was standing outside his feed store when Solveig walked past. He was 52 years old, thick through the chest, with a silver watch chain and the permanent easy authority of a man who had been the largest presence in a small room for so long that he had forgotten there were other kinds of rooms. He watched Solveig walk by with her pack and her straight back and her face that gave nothing away. "That's what happens," he said to no one in particular, but loudly enough for the street to hear, "when a man raises a daughter without proper guidance. A girl with any sense would have made herself useful to her stepmother. A girl with any real character would have found a way to contribute." He shook his head with the measured sadness of a man confirming his own prior judgment. Instead, she's wandering the street like a vagrant. No direction, no plan. It's a shame is what it is. Nobody on that street said anything different. Some people looked away. Most simply watched. Solveig kept walking. She tried 3 houses that afternoon. She had known these families her entire life, had attended church with them, had helped with harvests and barn raisings, and the kind of communal work that prairie life required of everyone. Each door opened partway, looked at her, and considered. Each door then expressed something regretful about available space, about difficult circumstances, about Marin Aldred's friendships in town, and Councilman Pruitt's opinions about the matter, and the general wisdom of not complicating one's own situation by associating too closely with someone who had apparently made enemies of people with the power to make that association costly. Each door closed. She slept that night in the livery stable in a corner behind the hay bales, wrapped in her mother's coat, with the Norwegian Bible pressed against her chest for warmth. She was not crying. She had moved past crying sometime around mile 8 of the walk from the homestead. What she felt now was something quieter and more deliberate than grief. It was the particular cold clarity of a person who has understood completely, and without remaining doubt that no one is coming to help them. In the morning she had a direction. Old Burke Voss lived 5 miles north of Havenwood on a claim he had filed in 1857. Before there was a town, before there was much of anything in Dakota Territory, except grass and wind and sky. He was 71 years old, Norwegian by birth, and so thoroughly removed from the opinions of Havenwood that he had not set foot on the main street in 3 years. His hands were ruined by arthritis that had been advancing for a decade. The fingers curled inward like old roots, unable now to grip a tool or manage anything requiring fine control. But his mind was as sharp and organized as a surveyor's diagram, and his memory held things that nobody else in the territory still knew. Arvid Aldred had known Burke Voss for 17 years. He had brought young Solveig out to the old man's claim every summer since she was old enough to walk the distance, sitting her at Burke's kitchen table, while the 2 men talked about weather and soil and the deep, patient grammar of prairie survival. Burke had taught her father things that could not be learned from books or neighbors, and Burke had, without Solveig fully understanding it at the time, begun teaching her those same things too. She walked the 5 miles north through a morning that had gone steel gray and bitter, and knocked on the door of a man she had not seen in 8 months. Burke Voss opened the door, looked at her face for one long moment, and stepped back to let her in without a word. He poured coffee. He listened without interrupting. He asked 3 questions when she finished and let her answer all 3 completely before he spoke again. "Your father came to me," Burke said, "about 2 years ago. He sat where you're sitting now. He looked at his ruined hands, then back at her. He asked me to teach you what I taught him. The real things," he said, "not the things everyone knows. The things that keep a person alive when everything else has failed." He paused. He said he had a feeling that you might need them on your own someday. He didn't say why. He didn't have to. Solveig sat very still. "I told him you were young yet," Burke continued. "I told him we had time." He looked at the window at the gray sky pressing down on the frozen grass. "I was wrong about that." He stood slowly the way a man stands when his body has its own opinion about the matter, and went to the back room. He came back with a rolled piece of paper that turned out to be a hand-drawn diagram, precise and detailed, of a structure that did not sit on the earth, but disappeared into it. "My father built one of these in Norway when I was a boy," Burke said, spreading the diagram carefully on the table. "I built one here in 1858. The Lakota showed me how to improve it. You go into the south face of a hill where the winter sun hits the entrance and keeps the approach from freezing completely. You cut down, not across. You let the earth be your walls, your ceiling, your insulation." He pointed with one bent finger at the cross-section drawing. "The ground holds at 55 degrees year-round. Doesn't matter if it's 40 below at the surface. The earth remembers every summer that has ever passed through it. It holds that warmth and keeps it until summer comes again." Solveig studied the diagram with the focused attention her father had given maps and weather patterns, the ability to look at something drawn on paper and immediately understand its physical reality in 3 dimensions. "There's a piece of land," Burke said, 30 acres on the east section of your father's original claim. The rough hillside above the creek bend the south-facing slope. He never thought worth filing on." He folded his hands on the table. "Marin's claim covers exactly what her lawyer wrote down. Her lawyer wrote down what she told him, and she never told him about those 30 acres. Because your father never thought they mattered." "They matter now," Solveig said. Burke almost smiled. "They matter now. She'll come looking. Pruitt will send people." "They'll look," Burke said. "I'll show you the entrance design. I'll show you the chimney pipe. From any direction, from any distance, it will look like nothing more than rock and frozen grass." He looked at the diagram, then at her. "You'll be invisible. But only if you build it right. And only if you build it soon." He looked at his hands for a moment, the hands that could no longer hold a shovel or drive a post. "I can't dig any more," he said. It cost him something to say it. "But you can tell me everything I need to know," Solveig said. "Everything," he said. "And you are Arvid Aldrid's daughter." He met her eyes. "You can dig." They started on the first day of October, when the ground was still workable, but the cold was already making its intentions clear. Burke walked the hillside with her that first morning, moving slowly, pointing out the exact section of south-facing slope where the angle was correct, where the natural drainage would carry water, away from any entrance where a fold in the terrain would conceal the approach from anyone coming from the direction of town. Solveig drove her first stake into the frozen grass and began. She dug for 8 hours that first day, cutting the entrance tunnel at the precise downward angle Burke specified, hauling earth back out in a canvas sling and scattering it across the hillside in patterns that matched the natural erosion of the terrain. Burke sat on a flat rock at the edge of the work and directed her with the quiet precision of a man who had held this knowledge for decades and understood finally that it was going somewhere that needed it. By the end of the first week, the entrance tunnel was complete and she had begun opening the main chamber. The dimensions Burke specified were exact 12 feet wide, 20 feet deep. Ceiling height of 6 feet at center walls of packed earth, cut cleanly and allowed to settle before the final compacting. The ceiling required cottonwood beams, which meant 3 miles to the creek, and backhauling logs one at a time on a travois she built herself from saplings and rope. She made that trip 11 times. At night, she slept in the unfinished chamber, wrapped in canvas on the bare earth floor. Even unfinished, even without the stove, the temperature in that space stayed close to 50 degrees, while the surface above it dropped to freezing and below. She lay in the dark and felt the earth holding its warmth around her, and understood in a way that went beyond the intellectual why Burke had called it survival. She learned during those weeks what no school had ever taught her. She learned how to read soil by its resistance and color, how to identify the layers that would compact firmly, and the layers that would crumble if disturbed. She learned how to brace a ceiling against the weight of frozen earth above it, how to angle a floor so that any water infiltration would run toward the entrance rather than pool in the living space. She learned how to pack earth walls so tight that they became almost stone smooth and hard, holding their shape against the pressure from outside. She learned most crucially how to make smoke disappear. The chimney was a 3-inch iron pipe salvaged from an abandoned well casing on a claim 8 miles east that Burke had known about for years. The pipe ran from the stove up through the ceiling at a precise angle he had calculated from memory, emerging at the surface between 2 rocks that had occupied that position since long before any homesteader arrived to notice them. Burke had her paint it the same gray-brown as the surrounding stone and pack the gap around its base with a mixture of clay and dead grass until it was indistinguishable from the natural debris between any 2 rocks on any Dakota hillside. The stove itself burned small and hot, consuming fuel completely, rather than smoldering, sending up a thread of vapor, rather than a column of smoke. In still air on a cold morning, it was visible if you were standing in exactly the right place, at exactly the right distance, looking at exactly the right angle. From any other position, it dissolved into the gray of the winter sky before it had traveled 20 feet. The stove came from the same abandoned claim as the pipe. A small iron box sitting in the ruins of a sod house whose owner had gone back east in 1882 and never returned. Solveig hauled it back on the travois over 2 days, the most grueling physical effort of her life. The iron box weighing more than she did, the ground uneven and frozen, the wind coming in from the northwest with a hostility she had stopped trying to understand. She installed it according to Burke's specifications, connected the flue, tested the draw. The first fire she lit in that stove on a November evening when the surface temperature had dropped to 15 below turned the chamber from cold to warm in 40 minutes. She sat on her bed and let the warmth reach her, and felt something she had not felt since September. She felt safe. The walls she insulated with dried grass, packed into cotton sacking, covered with buffalo hides that Burke had stored in his barn for years, save from a period in the 1870s when the herds still came through. The hides smelled of age and smoke and something older than either, and they held the heat with extraordinary efficiency, the chamber temperature stabilizing at 58 degrees, regardless of what the air outside was doing. She built furniture from cottonwood planks, a table rough but solid, 2 chairs, the second one for Burke, who came out twice a week when weather permitted to check her work and continue the education that her father had asked him to give her. She built shelves along the east wall and began filling them with the provisions she had been accumulating since October. Dried beans in cloth sacks, cornmeal in a sealed tin, smoked rabbit and smoked prairie chicken hanging from hooks she had driven into the ceiling beams, 3 crocks of rendered lard, 2 jars of wild berry preserves made in September from fruit along the creek, a distant memory now of a warmer world. She dug a root cellar below the main floor 3 feet deeper into the earth, insulated by the ground itself, maintained at a temperature cold enough to preserve, but never cold enough to freeze. Into it went turnips and dried corn, and 2 sacks of flour that Burke had left without ceremony at the entrance one morning. A quiet act of provision that he never mentioned. And she never thanked him for directly understanding that, between people who deal in practical things, the gesture itself was the entire conversation. She made a window, one small rectangle of glass fitted into a wooden frame in the east-facing wall just below ground level, oriented so that it caught the early morning light without being visible from any direction that a searching party would naturally approach from. The light it let in was thin and oblique, not enough to read by except on bright days, but enough to mark the passage of hours, enough to tell her when morning had become afternoon. Burke taught her to be completely quiet. In the first weeks, she had been careless about small sounds, the scrape of a chair, the clang of a pot against the stove. He corrected her with the patient persistence of a teacher who understood what was at stake. Sound travels through earth, he told her. Not far, but far enough. If they're quiet above you, you be quiet below. She learned to move with a deliberateness that eventually became natural, each action considered before undertaken, each noise accounted for. By December, she could exist in that underground space with a silence so complete that the only sounds were the wind above the creak of frost in the cottonwood beams, the soft draw of the stove, and the turn of her father's Bible pages in the candlelight. Councilman Pruitt had first spotted the smoke on a November morning while riding out to check a pasture lease on the east edge of his property holdings. The sight of it stopped him completely, his horse having to sidestep around his sudden stillness, a thread of smoke rising from a hillside where no structure had ever stood. He stood in his stirrups and stared at it for a full minute. Then he turned his horse toward town. The search parties he sent found nothing. 8 men the first time, 12 the second. Pruitt himself leading the third, covering every foot of that hillside with methodical intensity, walking directly over the entrance approach twice, without recognizing the fold of terrain for what it was, standing on the roof of Solvay's home for nearly 4 minutes, while arguing with one of the men about disturbed earth that he attributed to badgers. He felt nothing beneath his boots but solid frozen ground. By December, he had declared the matter settled. "The girl is dead," he announced to the council. "Froze out somewhere in October. The smoke is a natural phenomenon, gas from the ground. It happens in this territory." He said it with the finality of a man who had searched thoroughly and found nothing, which in his experience meant there was simply nothing to find. The smoke continued to rise every morning, indifferent to the matter being closed. It became a joke in Havenwood. People talked about it in the mercantile and in the saloon and at the church social. The smoke from nowhere. The ghost on the hillside. Old Hargreaves, who ran the saloon, started calling it the Aldred Fire, and the name stuck and people laughed about it with the particular pleasure of a mystery that has no consequences. Maybe it's the earth itself burning, someone said. Maybe it's a ghost, said someone else. Maybe, said a third who had opinions about Pruitt that he usually kept to himself. Desmond Pruitt just can't find what's right under his feet. There was laughter at that. Pruitt heard about it and did not laugh. Burke came out in the middle of December on a day when the temperature had dropped to 30 below, arriving at the entrance with the careful dignity of a man whose joints were conducting their own war against the cold. Solveig brought him inside and poured coffee and watched him sit in the chair she had made for him and look around the completed space with eyes that took in everything. He was quiet for a long time. Your father would be proud, he said finally. This is better than anything I ever built. Warmer, tighter, better hidden. He nodded slowly. They'll never find you here. No, Solveig said. They won't. Burke looked at her over his coffee cup. His pale eyes held something she could not quite name, something between pride and the particular sadness of a man who understands what he is looking at and what it has cost. Someday, he said, they may need to. She looked at him. I've been watching the sky, he said, and the animals, the way the cattle are standing, the direction the birds have been moving and when, the pressure in the air. He set his coffee down on her cottonwood table and folded his ruined hands in front of him. I've only seen this pattern one other time in my life. It was the winter of 1856. A Dakota winter that killed everything it touched. The people who survived were the ones who had gone into the earth. The ones who didn't survive. When? Solveig asked. Not tomorrow. Maybe not next month. But before spring. He picked up his coffee again. The storm is building. I can feel it the way I used to feel it in my hands before the arthritis took them. There's something coming that this territory hasn't seen in 30 years. Solveig looked at her shelves, the provisions she had accumulated with such effort over 3 months. Enough she had thought to last her through the worst of winter. Maybe enough now for more than just herself. They won't listen, she said. Burke nodded. They never do. Outside, the wind moved across the hillside with a sound that had no warmth in it at all. The chimney pipe drew steadily, sending its thin thread of smoke up through the gap between the rocks visible for miles in the still, cold air. Somewhere in Havenwood, 12 miles west, Desmond Pruitt was sitting in a warm building and telling someone that the smoke was nothing, that the girl was gone, that there was nothing on that hillside worth worrying about. Solveig added 2 more logs to the stove and went back to her father's Bible. She had started stockpiling additional wood that week, not the amount she needed, the amount that something she could not yet fully name was telling her to need. She was Arvid Aldred's daughter after all. And Arvid Aldred had taught her from the time she was old enough to hold a tool that the difference between the people who survived and the people who didn't was rarely courage. It was rarely strength. It was rarely anything dramatic at all. It was preparation. It was the willingness to do the hard, unglamorous, lonely work of getting ready for something that might never come. While the people around you lived in the comfortable assumption that their buildings were solid and their stores were full, and the worst that winter could offer was something they had already handled before. She thought about the way her father had sat her down when she was 12 years old, on a summer afternoon with the prairie wind coming through the open barn door, and walked her through the principles of earth building with a care and specificity that had seemed at the time like one of his many enthusiasms for things that worked. He had not been sharing an enthusiasm. He had been leaving her something. She had thought it was knowledge. She understood now that it was more than that. It was the specific, deliberate, carefully chosen knowledge that a father leaves for a daughter he loves in a world where daughters need things that fathers cannot always be there to provide. He had looked at Marin before the wedding with those pale blue eyes that read weather, and he had understood something about the forecast, and he had made his preparations. He had made her his preparation. She closed the Bible and set it on the shelf above her bed and blew out the candle and lay in the 58-degree dark, listening to the wind move across the hill above her. And she was not afraid. She was ready, and miles away in Havenwood, in buildings with walls and roofs and all the visible signs of permanence and safety, people who had never considered what the earth beneath their feet might be trying to tell them, went to sleep in the comfortable certainty that they had handled every Dakota winter so far. The sky above the territory held its breath. The storm was building, and only one person in 12 miles of frozen prairie knew it was coming. January arrived with a cold that had weight to it, the kind that pressed down on the prairie like a hand rather than moving through it, like wind. Solveig felt it in the increased demand on the stove, in the way the entrance tunnel held ice at its upper curve each morning, that had not been there the night before, in the slight drop of the chamber temperature from 58 to 56 degrees, that told her the frost line above was deepening. She responded the way she responded to every change in her situation, by paying attention, by adjusting, and by adding to her preparations rather than waiting to see whether the adjustment was enough. She had built a side chamber in November, a smaller excavation off the east wall of the main room originally intended as a wood store. Through January, she expanded it, cutting 2 feet deeper into the hillside and widening it to accommodate a second tier of split wood stacked floor to ceiling. She made 3 additional trips to the creek for deadfall, hauling it back on the travois in the gray early mornings, when the air was still and the chance of being seen from any distance was lowest. She added to the food store, smoking 2 more rabbits and a prairie chicken she had taken with snares set in the draw below the hill. She also, for the first time since October, began thinking about what would happen if the storm Burke had predicted was as large as he believed it would be. Not about herself. She had thought about herself extensively and had arrived at the conclusion that she was as prepared as she could make herself for whatever came. She began thinking about the town. 12 miles west, 300 people lived in buildings that were solid by the standards of what could be built on the Dakota Prairie in 1886. But solid by those standards meant something very specific. It meant walls of sawn lumber, sometimes single thickness, that held wind out in ordinary conditions, but had never been tested against wind of the kind that Burke described from 1856. It meant roofs that handled a normal season's snowfall, but had never borne the weight of what an extraordinary storm could produce in 48 hours of continuous accumulation. It meant wood piles that were adequate for a normal winter but would run short fast if the temperature dropped far enough for long enough. She could see from where she sat in her underground room with its 58-degree walls and its carefully managed stores and its chimney pipe that had been working without interruption since November exactly what was going to happen to those buildings and those wood piles and those people if Burke was right. She could see it, and she could do nothing about it, because Desmond Pruitt had declared her dead, and the town had laughed at her smoke, and there was not a soul in Havenwood who would have listened to a 17-year-old girl who lived in a hole in the ground tell them that something was coming. So she stacked more wood and she smoked more meat, and she checked every beam in her ceiling and every seam in her chimney pipe. And she waited. On a gray afternoon in the second week of January, she heard footsteps above her that were different from the search party sounds she had learned to identify. These were lighter, slower, moving without the organized pattern of men on a mission. They stopped. They started again. They circled the area around the concealed entrance with the hesitant curiosity of someone who was not sure what they were looking for, but suspected they were close to it. Then silence. Then, very quietly, 3 distinct knocks on the earth above the entrance approach. Not the random contact of a walking stick. Deliberate, spaced, the kind of knocking that means something. Solveig sat perfectly still for a full minute. Then she moved to the entrance tunnel and listened. Nothing. She eased up the tunnel to the concealed door and put her ear against it. From the other side, barely audible, came a voice. "I know you're in there." A woman's voice, low, careful, aware of carrying. "I'm not here to cause you harm. I'm here because I have no one else I can say certain things to." Solveig did not open the door. "My name is Harriet Pruitt," the voice said. "I am Desmond Pruitt's wife, and I want you to know that I think my husband is wrong. About you. About all of it." A pause long enough that Solveig thought perhaps the woman had gone. Then, "I can't say that in town. I can't say it to his face. I can't say it to anyone who would take it back to him." Another pause. "But I can say it here. To the hillside if nothing else. To the smoke that comes from nowhere." Solveig listened to the sound of something being set down on the frozen ground. A soft thud. Fabric against earth. "I left something at the entrance," the woman said. "You don't have to trust me. You don't have to open the door. But I hope you're warm enough, and I hope you're eating enough. And I hope you know that not everyone in that town thinks the way my husband thinks." Footsteps moving away, steady and unhurried. Solveig waited another full minute. Then she opened the door 2 inches and looked out at the late afternoon light, falling gray and cold across the hillside. A canvas sack sat on the ground at the entrance, tied closed with a piece of twine. She reached out and pulled it inside. Flour. A good 10 pounds of it, and beneath the flour, wrapped in cloth, a small jar of rendered fat, and a paper packet of dried apple slices. She sat with that sack in her lap for a long time in the 58-degree warmth of her underground home, thinking about what it meant that the wife of the man who had tried 4 times to find and displace her had just left provisions at her door. Thinking about what it cost a woman to walk 5 miles out of town in January and knock on a piece of frozen earth and say what Harriet Pruitt had said, knowing that if her husband ever learned of it, the cost would be considerable. She thought about her father and the way he had always insisted that inside most situations that looked simple, there was a more complicated truth waiting for someone patient enough to find it. She put the flour on the shelf beside her own supply and went back to work. February came in with a peculiarity that Burke had been watching for. The temperature swung in ways that didn't follow the normal pattern of a Dakota winter. Days of unusual warmth, almost spring-like in their softness, followed by sudden hard freezes that arrived without the gradual buildup that usually preceded them. The wind shifted direction repeatedly in the course of a single day, backing and filling like something that couldn't make up its mind. The sky in the south and west had a quality that Burke described when he came out in the first week of February as loaded, like a gun that's been cocked, he said, sitting in his chair with both hands around his coffee. It doesn't look dangerous right now. It looks quiet. But it's been made ready for something. He had been watching the cattle on the homestead south of town. They were clustering in ways he hadn't seen in 30 years, pressing together in the low ground, refusing to move to the higher pasture, where the grass was still accessible under the shallow snow cover. He had been watching the birds, the few species that wintered in the territory, and they were behaving with an agitation that had no obvious cause. He had been watching the sky every morning and evening, reading the colors and the cloud patterns against everything his memory held of every winter he had lived through in Dakota. How long? Solveig asked. Burke was quiet for a moment. Less time than I'd like, he said finally. More time than they'll use well. I should tell someone. Burke looked at her steadily. Who would you tell Pruitt, the council that declared you dead in December? He shook his head, not unkindly. They wouldn't hear it from me in good years. They won't hear it from you now. He set down his coffee cup. The only thing you can do is be ready. More ready than you think you need to be. She was already adding to the woodpile every day that weather permitted, dragging deadfall from the creek bed and cutting it to stove length and stacking it in the side chamber. She was already adding to the food stores, already checking and rechecking the chimney. The drainage channels, the structural integrity of every beam in the ceiling. Now she doubled all of it. In Havenwood, 12 miles west, Councilman Desmond Pruitt was having a different kind of February. A trader named Gideon Marsh had come through from Bismarck in the last week of January, stopping at Pruitt's feed store to settle an account and staying for coffee and conversation. Marsh traveled the territory routes regularly and had developed a weather sense that most men who spent that much time on the open prairie acquired whether they wanted to or not. He told Pruitt over that coffee that he had a bad feeling about the coming weeks, that he had seen certain things on his ride south that reminded him of the winter of 1856, which he had survived only because he had been close enough to a settlement to reach it before the storm closed everything down. That he thought Havenwood might want to consider taking some precautions, laying in additional fuel, reinforcing the weaker structures, making sure the most vulnerable residents were housed somewhere solid. Pruitt listened to this with the patient expression of a man waiting for a conversation to end. Gideon, he said when Marsh had finished, every man who's spent time on the prairie thinks he can read the big storms coming. Most of them are wrong most of the time. He poured more coffee with the confidence of a man whose buildings were solid and whose woodpile was adequate. We've had Dakota winters before. We'll have this one the same way." Marsh left the next morning heading south toward warmer country and said nothing more about it. Pruitt said nothing to the council about Marsh's warning. He made no announcement to the town. He posted no notice, sent no riders to the outlying homesteads, made no suggestion that anyone might want to take the kind of precautions that a man with some experience of serious plains winters would have recognized as basic prudence. He had his reasons. The council election was scheduled for April. There were two men in Havenwood who had been talking for the past year about whether Desmond Pruitt's 11 years on the council had perhaps been long enough, whether it might be time for some new thinking. Pruitt understood that the perception of leadership was as important as leadership itself, and that nothing undermined a man's authority faster than creating alarm over a threat that then failed to materialize. If he told the town to prepare for a major storm, and no major storm came, he would look like exactly the kind of excitable, credulous man that his political opponents were suggesting he had become. So he said nothing. He told himself that Marsh was probably wrong. He told himself that he had lived through 20 Dakota winters and knew what a serious storm looked like in its approach. He told himself that the mild days in early February were a sign that the worst was already past. He told himself all of these things with the practiced conviction of a man who had learned over decades in positions of authority that the most important person to persuade was always himself. The 2nd of March arrived with a morning so mild that people in Havenwood came outside without their heavy coats, tilting their faces toward a sun that felt almost like April. Children played in the street. Women visited on doorsteps. A farmer on the edge of town began calculating whether the ground might be workable for early planting if this warmth held. By noon, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. By 3 in the afternoon, it had dropped 30. By the time the sun went down behind a sky that had turned the particular flat white that means the atmosphere above is doing something serious, the wind was coming from the northwest at 30 miles an hour, and building and the snow was beginning not the gentle, sifting snow of a normal winter storm, but a driven, horizontal, blinding snow that turned the world beyond arm's reach into a white wall. By midnight, the wind was at 50 miles an hour. By morning, it was beyond what the instruments available in Havenwood could measure. The temperature at dawn on March 3rd was 42 degrees below zero and falling. Inside the dugout on the hillside east of town, Solveig fed the stove steadily and listened to the voice of the storm above her. She had heard wind before. She had heard Dakota blizzards that shook the walls of her father's sod house and drove snow through every gap in the construction. She had never heard anything like this. This was not wind the way she understood wind. This was something more fundamental, something that seemed to come from the ground up as much as from the sky down, a sustained roar that made the earth itself vibrate at a frequency she could feel in her back teeth. The temperature inside the dugout, 58 degrees. Outside, 42 below zero, and a wind that would kill an unprotected person in minutes. The beams above her head creaked. Once, twice, then settled. The chimney pipe drew steadily. The earth walls held their warmth with the patient indifference of something that has been maintaining its temperature through ice ages and prairie fires and every variety of human crisis for longer than human memory extends. She was safe. 12 miles west, Havenwood was not. The storm found every weakness in every structure in that town, with the methodical thoroughness of something that had time and understood how to use it. The gaps in the lumber walls that had seemed minor in ordinary cold became channels for wind that dropped the interior temperature of a room faster than a stove could compensate. Roofs that had handled the weight of normal snowfall were presented with drifts that accumulated not in inches but in feet, packed by the wind to a density that turned snow into something closer to ice. The strongest buildings in town held. The weaker ones began to fail before the first day was out. On the second day of the storm, 3 homes on the east side of town collapsed under the weight of the drifts. The families inside escaped with their lives and very little else moving into whatever standing structure would take them, cramming bodies into spaces not designed for that many bodies, burning furniture when the wood supply ran low. On the third day, the roof of the Mercantile came down in the early afternoon. No one was killed, but the building that had been Havenwood's largest enclosed space was gone, and with it a significant portion of the town's centralized food storage. By the fourth day, people were burning tables, chairs, shelves, anything that would produce heat. The animals in the barns were dying despite the efforts of the men who risked their lives moving between buildings in the blinding white roped together, moving by feel when their eyes gave them nothing useful. On the fourth night in the wreckage of what had been a prosperous, solid, well-organized small Dakota town, Councilman Desmond Pruitt sat in the reduced warmth of his feed store, with 9 other people and a fire built from the broken remnants of display shelving, and understood for the first time in his adult life what it felt like to be genuinely, helplessly afraid. 17 people died in the first 5 days. Some froze in buildings that could no longer hold adequate warmth. Some were lost in the white between structures, the rope lines having run out before the distance was covered, found later when the snow around them gave up its shape. One was the farmer who had been calculating his early planting on the warm morning of March 2nd, caught in the open, when the storm arrived faster than anyone had predicted. Pruitt knew some of these people by name. He had sold feed to their families. He had voted on matters affecting their homesteads. He had stood on the main street of Havenwood and spoken with the authority of a man who understood how things worked. On the 5th day of the storm, in a brief lull when the wind dropped just enough to make the outdoors something other than instantly lethal, Pruitt wrapped himself in everything he owned that could be layered and fought his way to the east wall of the feed store, where a window had been boarded over in November against the cold. He pried one board loose and looked out at the white world. The hillside east of town was barely visible through the still driving snow. The distance was too great, the visibility too poor. The world too thoroughly rearranged by 5 days of catastrophic weather for anything to look like anything it normally looked like. But there, rising from somewhere on that hillside, threading up through the driven snow with a patience and steadiness that seemed almost deliberate, was a thin gray line of smoke. Pruitt stared at it for a long time. The smoke from nowhere. The girl he had declared dead in December. The hole in the ground he had searched for and never found. The preparation he had called animal behavior. The survival he had called vagrancy. The knowledge he had dismissed as the desperate improvisation of a girl with no prospects and no direction. The smoke rose steadily thin and gray, visible even through the storm, because the fire that produced it had not gone out in 5 days and would not go out because the person who had built and tended it had prepared for exactly this, had prepared for worse than this, had built something that the worst storm in 30 years of Dakota history was failing to find any weakness in. Pruitt put the board back on the window. He sat down on the floor of his feed store among the 9 people keeping each other warm with shared body heat and the last remnants of his display shelving. And he did not speak for a very long time. That same evening, as the temperature outside pressed toward 50 below, and the wind found new gaps in walls that had been adequate, that morning a sound came from the direction of the dugout entrance, faint through the roar of the storm, the sound of the concealed door being opened from outside. Solveig was at the stove when she heard it. She took the candle lantern and moved to the entrance tunnel and looked up toward the door and saw coming down the tunnel on hands and knees, with the last organized effort of a man who had used everything he had to get there. Old Burke Voss. She was down the tunnel and beside him before he had finished the descent, her hand on his arm, steadying him, guiding him the remaining feet into the main chamber and onto the chair that had been waiting for him since November. He was coated in frost. His eyebrows, his coat, the fabric of his trousers from the knee down, all of it white with the accumulated evidence of a walk that should have been impossible, and that he had made anyway because his own house, the one-room timber structure he had built in 1857 and maintained for 30 years, had begun to fail around him on the afternoon of the 5th day. He sat in the chair and let her remove his outer layers and wrap him in the wool blanket from her bed and press a tin cup of hot coffee into his damaged hands. And for a while he simply breathed the breath of a man who has arrived somewhere after being not certain he would arrive. "I built this with you," he said, finally looking around the chamber that held its steady warmth, while the storm spent itself uselessly against the hillside above. "I never thought I'd need it myself." Solveig sat across from him at the cottonwood table. "I built the chair for you," she said simply. "I always thought you'd need it eventually." Something moved in his pale eyes, the closest thing to surprise that a 71-year-old man who has seen most of what the world offers is capable of showing. Then slowly he smiled. On the 6th day of the storm, 2 more people died in Havenwood. On the 7th day, the wind began almost imperceptibly at first to ease. On the morning of the 8th day, for the first time in a week, a person could stand outside and see more than 10 feet in any direction. The cold remained savage. The snow was everywhere, drifted in shapes that made the familiar geography of the town almost unrecognizable. Buildings that had stood for years were buried to their eaves. The main street was a valley between white walls 8 feet high. But the wind had stopped. Pruitt emerged from the feed store into a silence so complete after 7 days of roaring that it felt like a physical substance, like something he was walking through, rather than simply walking in. He looked at the destruction around him. He looked at the people coming out of the other surviving structures, their faces showing the particular hollow expression of people who have been frightened for so long that the fear has temporarily exhausted itself. He looked east toward the hillside. The smoke was still rising, thin and gray and steady, climbing into a sky that had gone the pale, clean blue that follows the worst storms, a blue so clear it looked newly made. The smoke rose and dispersed and rose again, with the patience of a fire that had been carefully tended through 7 days of the most extreme weather in a generation. Pruitt turned to the people gathered in the street around him. "We need to move," he said. His voice had lost something, the particular tone of absolute authority that had characterized it for 11 years on that council. The register of a man who expected to be obeyed because he had always been obeyed. What remained was simpler and more honest. It was the voice of a man who understood exactly how wrong he had been, and exactly what that wrongness had cost. "There's shelter on that hillside," he said. "There's been shelter on that hillside all winter. We're going to go find it." 23 people gathered what they could carry and began the long walk east through the drifted snow toward the thin gray thread of smoke rising from the hillside where a 17-year-old girl had spent the winter building something that the most powerful man in Havenwood had declared 4 times over simply did not exist. The walk east took nearly 3 hours. 3 hours that should have been 40 minutes on a clear day, on a road that 23 people knew by memory, reduced to a grinding, exhausting struggle through drifts that in places rose above a man's waist, and in other places had been scoured by the wind down to bare frozen ground as hard and slick as iron. They moved in a rough column, the strongest at the front, breaking trail the weakest in the middle, held up by whoever was beside them. Everyone roped together with the feed store line that Pruitt had thought to bring. One of the few genuinely useful decisions he had made in the past 7 days. The cold was still savage. Whatever the actual temperature was, it was the kind of cold that turned exhaled breath to ice crystals. Before it had traveled 6 inches from a person's face, the kind that found the gap between a coat collar and a hat brim, and worked on that exposed strip of skin with focused impersonal efficiency. They did not talk much. Talking cost warmth. Pruitt led from the front-breaking trail through the deeper drifts with his body, because he was still the largest person in the group. And because it was, he understood in some way that had not required articulation, the correct thing for him to do. His lungs ached with every breath of air that was too cold for lungs to process comfortably. His feet, despite 2 pairs of wool socks and good boots, had gone from painful to numb somewhere around the first mile, and he had made the calculation that numb was preferable to painful and kept moving. Behind him came people he had known for years, families from the church, men who had served on committees with him, women whose names he knew and whose circumstances he had voted on in council sessions. Old Whitmore, the schoolteacher, supported on either side by 2 of the younger men. The Hendricks children, 4 of them wrapped in everything their parents had been able to put on them. The youngest one carried on her father's back, and near the back of the column, moving with the deliberate, careful steps of a woman who was conserving exactly as much energy as she needed to conserve, and not one movement more Marin Aldred. Pruitt had seen her emerge from the ruins of the Homestead Supply Office on the south end of the main street, one of the structures that had held its roof but lost so much heat through its inadequate walls that the people inside had spent the final 2 days unable to feel their feet. She had said nothing when she joined the group. She had taken a place near the back without being directed there, and had kept moving without complaint through the 3 hours of difficult terrain. Pruitt did not speak to her. He was not sure there was anything he could say that the situation had not already said more clearly than he was capable of. He focused on the smoke. It was the only fixed point in a landscape that the storm had rearranged almost beyond recognition. The familiar rolls and draws of the East Prairie buried under white. The usual landmarks either gone or transformed into shapes that bore no relationship to their summer selves. But the smoke was there, thin and gray, and absolutely steady, rising from the hillside, with the patience of something that had never doubted itself for a single moment of the 7 days that had just passed. He followed it the way a sailor follows a lighthouse. Without it, he was not certain he could have found the hillside at all, much less the specific section of south-facing slope where the entrance was concealed. Without it, he understood all 23 of them would have been navigating by memory and approximation through a landscape that memory could no longer reliably map. Without the smoke from nowhere, they would have been lost. He thought about that as he walked, breaking trail through a drift that came to his chest and required him to essentially swim through it for 10 feet before the ground rose and the snow shallowed. He thought about what it meant that the only reliable point of navigation in 7 days of catastrophe was a fire that a 17-year-old girl had kept burning in a hole in the ground that he had spent 4 months trying to find and extinguish. He did not reach any comfortable conclusions. They found the entrance by following the smoke down to the hillside and then along the south-facing slope until the ground changed underfoot, until the snow gave way to a stretch of cleared earth, and then until the fold in the terrain revealed itself for what it was, a deliberate, carefully chosen approach, corridor-oriented so that anyone coming from the direction of town would walk past it without ever seeing the gap in the hillside that it led to. Pruitt stopped at the entrance. It was the first time he had seen it, despite 4 searches of this hillside. A low opening framed in cottonwood timber, fitted with a door of plank wood. That was, he noted, with something he could not quite name, very solidly built. A step down into a tunnel that angled into the earth at a gradient that would drain water away from whatever lay beyond. Above the door, between 2 rocks that he recognized with a start, as the same 2 rocks he had examined and dismissed on the 3rd search, the tip of an iron pipe protruded an inch above the stone. A thread of smoke rose from it into the still, cold air. He had stood in front of it without seeing it. He stood in front of it now and raised his hand and knocked. The sound his knuckles made on that cottonwood door was the sound of a man who understood finally and completely what he was asking for. The door opened. Solveig Aldred stood in the entrance of the home she had built with her own hands, from the October earth of a hillside that everyone in Havenwood had walked past for years, without ever considering what it might be useful for. She was wearing her father's wool overshirt and her mother's winter coat, and the expression of a person who had known this moment was coming without knowing exactly when it would arrive. Her pale blue eyes, her father's eyes, moved across the group, gathered on the slope above the entrance, with the calm assessment of someone who had spent months learning to read situations quickly and accurately. They found Pruitt first. "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was even, not cold, not warm. Even the way the temperature of the earth 50 feet below the surface is even the same in every season, unmoved by what happens above it. "You said I was living like an animal. You said no decent person disappears into the ground and hides from the world." Pruitt's face was red with cold, and something that had nothing to do with cold. He had prepared words on the walk east, some sequence of explanation and apology that had seemed adequate when he assembled it in his head, but which now, standing in front of her, seemed like precisely the wrong kind of thing to say. He discarded it. "I was wrong," he said. "We have children with us, old people. They will die before nightfall if we can't find shelter." Solveig looked past him at the group on the slope. The Hendricks children huddled together, old Whitmore barely able to stand. The faces of people she had known her whole life stripped by 7 days of extremity down to something more honest than the faces they wore on ordinary days. Faces that held no mockery now, no comfortable judgment. Only the transparent and completely genuine fear of people who understood that they were out of options. Her eyes found Marin Aldred near the back of the group. Marin was looking at her. The calculating expression that Solveig remembered from the kitchen table in September. The expression of a woman with a plan and the patience to execute it was gone. What remained was something that Marin Aldred had probably not shown another human being in many years. It was simply the face of a person who is cold and frightened and has nowhere else to go. Solveig held her stepmother's gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she stepped back from the door and said, "Come in. All of you. There is room." She said it the way her father would have said it, without performance, without the satisfaction of a person who has been proven right and wants the proof acknowledged. She said it as a simple statement of fact, the way you state the temperature of the ground or the direction of the prevailing wind. There is room. Come in. They came in. 23 people filing down the entrance tunnel into a space that was 12 feet wide and 20 feet deep and maintained at all times at a temperature of 58 degrees. The difference between the air outside and the air inside the dugout was at that moment 100 degrees. The people who entered first stopped moving when they felt it, the warmth rising to meet them. As they descended the tunnel, and several of them simply stood where they were for a moment, with their eyes closed. The way a person stands in the first moment of something they had stopped believing was still possible. The Hendricks children began to cry, all 4 of them quietly and without apparent embarrassment. Their father held them and said nothing. Old Whitmore sat down on the floor immediately inside the entrance because his legs had decided they were done, and 2 of the younger men sat down beside him, and nobody suggested he should stand up. Pruitt stood in the center of the main chamber and turned slowly, looking at the walls, the ceiling, the shelves, the stove with its steady warmth, the root cellar door in the back corner, the small east-facing window that let in a slant of pale winter light, the furniture made by hand from cottonwood planks. He looked at the tallow candles on the shelves and the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, and the Norwegian Bible on the shelf above the bed built into the wall, and the careful, functional, thoroughly considered order of a space that had been designed and built and maintained by a person who understood exactly what she was doing and why. It was, he realized, a better home than most of the homes in Havenwood. Not larger, not more decorated, but better in the ways that actually mattered better. Insulated, better heated, better provisioned, more structurally sound, more intelligently designed for the reality of the climate it existed within. He had called it a hole in the ground. He had called it animal behavior. He had spent 4 months trying to find it in order to put a stop to it. He turned and found Solveig watching him with those steady, pale eyes. He looked away first. In the far corner of the chamber, in the cottonwood chair that had been built for him and had been waiting for him since November, Burke Voss sat with his ruined hands folded in his lap and watched Pruitt with the expression of a man who has lived long enough to see most things come around to where they were always going to end up. He said nothing. He did not need to. The work of settling 23 people into a space designed for one required the kind of practical problem-solving that Solveig had been developing since October. She organized it with a calm efficiency that Pruitt watched and could not have described in precise terms, but recognized as the rarest kind of authority, the kind that does not announce itself, that simply solves the problems in front of it in the correct order without requiring acknowledgement or direction. She arranged the sleeping positions along the walls, the most vulnerable nearest the stove, the children, together in the center, where body heat would accumulate and where the temperature would be most stable. She assessed the food stores and the number of people and the likely duration of the situation, with the same methodical attention to physical reality that she had applied to every problem since October. Then, she began cooking. She fed 23 people that first evening from stores she had built through 3 months of solitary labor. The portions were not large. No one complained. No one who had spent 7 days uncertain of whether they would see another morning complained about the size of a bowl of bean soup in a room that was 58 degrees warm. On the third night, when the children were asleep and the adults were arranged in the dim warmth of the chamber around the stove's steady heat, Pruitt moved to sit near Solveig, who was reading her father's Bible by the light of a single candle. She looked up. He sat for a moment without speaking, which was not natural for him, which cost him something which she noticed. "Why?" he said finally. The word was simple because the simpler it was, the more it held. Why after the public humiliation on the main street? Why after 4 search parties? Why after a declaration of death issued to the town council with the confidence of a man who had decided the question? Why after Marin? Why after all of it had she opened the door? Solveig looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Burke asleep in his corner chair, with his ruined hands folded in his lap, and his chest rising and falling with the steady breath of a man at peace. "An old man told me something once," she said. "He told me that survival is never only about yourself, that the skills you build and the stores you put up and the shelter you make, they belong to more than just you in the end. They belong to whatever situation needs them." She looked back at Pruitt. "My father believed the same thing. He didn't build this place, but he built me. And he didn't build me to let people die in the snow because they were unkind to me." Pruitt was quiet for a long moment. The stove ticked softly. Someone across the chamber shifted in sleep. "I suppressed a warning," he said. "A trader from Bismarck. He told me in January that something serious was building. I didn't pass it on." He said it flatly, the way you say something that needs to be said and cannot be softened by the manner of saying it. "People died because of that." Solveig looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "I know you know. What will you do with that?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the fire through the grate of the stove for a while, the orange light moving on his face, the face of a man conducting an interior reckoning of the kind that cannot be hurried or abbreviated. "Whatever I can," he said finally. "It won't be enough, but it'll be whatever I can." She nodded and went back to her Bible, and he sat with the fire for a long time before he moved back to his place along the wall. In the back corner of the chamber, Marin Aldred had been awake for this conversation. She lay with her face turned toward the wall, listening to the breathing of 22 other people in a room that her stepdaughter had built alone in the earth of a hillside that Marin had never considered worth documenting in a legal claim. She had thought in September that she had taken everything. She understood now with the particular clarity that extreme circumstances force on a person, regardless of whether they want it, that she had taken exactly the things that could be taken, and had left behind precisely the things that could not. She had left behind the knowledge in Solvay's head. She had left behind the skills in Solvay's hands. She had left behind 30 acres of rough hillside that she had considered worthless, and that had turned out to be the only piece of ground in 12 miles of Dakota prairie with a warm room under it. In the morning, she was still facing the wall when Solvay moved past her to start the breakfast fire. She did not turn around, but after a moment, in a voice low enough that only Solvay could hear it, she said 2 words: "Thank you." Solvay did not pause in her movement toward the stove. She did not look back. "You're welcome," she said. And that was all that passed between them on the subject then or later, because some things are complete in 2 words, and adding more to them takes away from, rather than adding to what they contain. The 2 weeks that followed were unlike anything any of the 23 people who lived through them would be fully able to describe afterward. The space was too small for that many people, and yet it held them. The provisions were calculated for one person's winter, and yet stretched and managed with careful attention. They fed 23 people adequately enough that no one grew weak enough to be in danger. The warmth that the earth provided freely and the stove supplemented was enough, always just enough to keep the temperature in the chamber at the level that a human body can not only survive, but actually function within. Solvay managed it the way she had managed everything since October, by paying close attention to what the situation actually required, rather than what she had expected it to require, by adapting without drama when the reality differed from the plan, by making decisions quickly and implementing them without waiting for consensus from people who were not in a position to contribute useful consensus. The children, once they had warmed through and eaten and slept, adapted with the resilience that children bring to situations that would break adults. They played games in the narrow passage between the sleeping walls. They listened to stories told by old Whitmore, who turned out to have an inexhaustible supply of them. They asked Solvay questions about the construction of the dugout with the uninhibited curiosity of people who have not yet learned to pretend that ignorance is sophistication, and she answered all of them with the same patient specificity that Burke had always used with her. The adults contributed what they could. The men who had the strength for it took turns hauling wood from the side chamber to the stove. The women organized the sleeping arrangements each night with the pragmatic efficiency of people who have decided that the situation requires cooperation and are going to cooperate. Pruitt, who was one of the strongest people in the group, broke trail twice to assess the conditions outside and reported back without editorial, simply what he had seen and what it meant for their situation. Burke spent most of his time in his chair, sleeping more than he had slept in years, eating the portions Solvay brought him with the diminished appetite of a very old man who has expended the last of his large reserves and is now running on what remains. But when he was awake, he was fully present, watching the management of the crisis with the satisfied expression of a man watching something he built being used exactly as it was designed to be used. He told Solvay on the 5th day of the group's stay that he thought he had perhaps earned his rest. "You have a few more years in you yet," she said. He smiled at that, the full smile of a man who knows something. The person speaking to him does not yet know, but will come to understand in time. "Perhaps," he said. "Perhaps a few." On the 12th day, a sound reached the dugout from the direction of town that Solveig did not recognize at first, the sound of horses moving through deep snow. Several horses with the purposeful rhythm of animals being guided rather than wandering. She went to the entrance and climbed to the surface and stood in the bright, cold air of a Dakota morning that smelled of snow and distance, and something that might eventually become spring if it was patient enough. Coming from the west, following the rough track that her own 23 visitors had broken days earlier, was a party of riders and 2 wagons moving slowly through the remaining drifts. They were coming from the direction of Bismarck, from the direction of the territorial government, and the relief organizations that had begun mobilizing when the size of the storm became clear from the reports of the settlements it had passed through before reaching Havenwood. She watched them come for a while. Then she went back inside and told the others. The relief party found Havenwood in the condition that the storm had left it, 17 dead, several buildings destroyed, others damaged beyond safe habitation. The town's food stores significantly depleted, and its fuel supply critically low. They found a population that had survived in the structures that had held in conditions that had been genuinely dangerous, with the hollow eyes and deliberate movements of people who had been afraid for a long time. And they found 3 miles east of the ruined town, a hillside with a warm room in it, occupied by 23 people in substantially better condition than anyone in Havenwood proper. Among the relief party was a man named Edmund Holt, a Norwegian-born carpenter from Fargo, who had signed on with the relief organization because the wages were fair and because he was, as he had been for most of his 32 years, looking for a place that felt more like a destination than a waypoint. He came to the hillside on the 2nd day of the relief operation, sent to assess whether the dugout structure might provide any useful model for emergency shelter construction going forward. He descended the entrance tunnel with a lantern and an engineer's eye, and spent 2 hours examining every element of the construction: the angle of the entrance, the ceiling support system, the stove installation, the chimney pipe design, the root cellar, the drainage channels, the wall composition and packing technique. Then he went and found the person who had built it and asked if she would walk him through the design decisions. Solveig spent the afternoon explaining the dugout to Edmund Holt, not as a guide describing a fixed thing, but as a builder describing the reasoning behind each choice, the logic of each design element, the problems each feature was solving. He listened the way Burke listened, which was to say, completely without the half-attention of a person waiting for their turn to speak. And he asked the kind of questions that told her he wasn't merely documenting, but actually understanding. By the end of the afternoon, he had filled a notebook with diagrams and measurements and structural notes. By the end of the 2nd day, he had extended his contract with the relief organization indefinitely. By the end of the week, everyone who had been watching had understood that the carpenter from Fargo was not staying because of the relief work. On the day the relief wagons prepared to move the most seriously affected Havenwood residents to Bismarck for the remainder of the winter, Councilman Desmond Pruitt gathered the survivors and the relief workers and the journalists who had come with the relief party in the area outside the dugout entrance. The cleared ground above the south-facing slope where the winter sun was finally tentatively beginning to offer something that could be called warmth. He had spent 3 days composing what he wanted to say and had arrived finally at the understanding that the thing he wanted to say could not be composed in advance, that it would have to be said in the simple order in which it was true. "I owe this young woman my life," he said. His voice carried without effort in the still, cold air. "That is the simplest and most complete way to say it. and I want to say it publicly in front of witnesses, because it was public shame that I brought on her, and public acknowledgement is the minimum of what's owed." He paused. "I called her an animal. I led search parties to find the shelter she built and put a stop to it. I declared her dead when I couldn't find her, which was not because she was dead, but because I was incompetent." He let that word stand on its own for a moment. "When the storm came, she opened her door. She fed me. She kept my feet from freezing. She saved my life and the lives of 22 other people who had given her no particular reason to do any of those things." He turned to Solveig, who was standing to one side of the gathered crowd, with the expression of someone who would have preferred this not to be happening, but understood that it needed to. "I was wrong about everything," he said. "Wrong about you. Wrong about what survival looks like. Wrong about what it means to be prepared. Wrong about what decency actually requires of a person." He held her gaze. "I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not asking for it. I'm just saying what's true because the truth is all I have left to offer." Solveig looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the gathered crowd. The survivors, the relief workers, the journalists with their notebooks, all of them waiting for what she would say. She thought about her father who had sent her to Burke Voss in the only way available to him through 17 years of deliberate preparation, through the specific and carefully chosen knowledge he had planted in her before he ran out of time to plant more. She thought about Burke inside the dugout in his chair, too tired now to stand in the cold, but present in every other way that mattered. She thought about the 8 months since September, the October digging, the November cold, the December searches that passed within feet of her. Without finding her, the January darkness, the February signs, the March storm that had tried the structure she had built and found nothing in it to break. She thought about what her father had been trying to give her, and what Burke had finished giving her, and what the winter had completed. "I didn't build this place to prove anyone wrong," she said. "I built it because I had nowhere else to go, and because my father had given me the knowledge to build it, and I had no reason not to use what I've been given." She looked at the dugout entrance, the cottonwood frame door in the hillside that still, even knowing it was there, required you to know where to look to see it. The earth doesn't care about dignity or reputation, or what the council decided in December. The earth just holds its temperature and waits. It was doing that before any of us were here, and it will be doing it long after. She paused. "The only question is whether you know enough to use what it offers." She let that sit for a moment. "You can laugh at someone's preparations," she said. "You can call them foolish. You can call them animals. You can search for what they've built 4 times and declare it doesn't exist when you can't find it. But the storm doesn't know what you called them. The cold doesn't care about the council vote." She looked across the faces in front of her. "When the worst comes, the only thing that matters is whether someone somewhere did the work ahead of time. And if they're good people, they'll let you in from the cold, even if you didn't deserve it." She stepped back. That was all. The journalists wrote it down. The relief workers remembered it. The survivors carried it with them in the way that people carry the things said in the worst moments of their lives, not as quotations, but as something that had entered them and changed the shape of something inside. 3 weeks after the relief party arrived, Edmund Holt presented Solveig with a drawing. It was a plan for an expanded version of the dugout, larger with a second chamber, an improved ventilation, and a more sophisticated drainage system. It was drawn with the precision of a trained carpenter who had spent 3 weeks thinking about almost nothing else. He didn't say anything when he gave it to her. He just handed it over and waited. She studied it for a long time. She pointed to 2 elements and explained why they would need to be modified for the specific soil composition of this hillside. He took out his notebook and made the corrections without argument. "You could stay," she said finally, "if you were planning to stay. This work would go faster with someone who knows timber." "I was planning to stay," he said. She looked at him for a moment with the same steady assessment she brought to every practical problem. "Good," she said, and went back inside to check on Burke. Maren Aldred left Havenwood in the spring on one of the first wagons heading east when the roads cleared. She left quietly without announcement, settling her affairs in the town, in the way of a person who understands that the place they are in is no longer the place for them. She did not speak to Solveig before she left, but 3 weeks after her departure, a letter arrived. It was short. It said that a lawyer in Bismarck had been instructed to register 30 acres of Dakota hillside land to the name of Solveig Aldred as the sole heir of Arvid Aldred's unregistered claim, and that the documentation was complete and the title was clear. It said nothing else except Maren's name at the bottom, written in the precise hand of a woman who had always paid careful attention to the way things were recorded. Solveig folded the letter and put it in her father's Bible between 2 pages he had marked with a strip of leather, in what must have been the last year of his life. She read those pages with the attention they deserved. Then she closed the Bible and put it back on the shelf, and went outside to see what the spring was doing to the hillside. Desmond Pruitt resigned from the town council in May as the rebuilding of Havenwood began in earnest. He wrote a letter to the surviving council members explaining his decision in terms that were honest to the point of being uncomfortable to read, acknowledging the specific decisions he had made and the specific consequences they had produced, and declining to offer any mitigating context, because he had decided that mitigating context was exactly the kind of thing he had been too comfortable with for too long. He spent the summer helping rebuild the homes that had been destroyed, contributing lumber from his own yard at cost and labor from his own hands without charge. He was not a young man, and the work was hard, and he did it with the steady persistence of someone who has identified a debt that cannot be paid in full but can be worked on every available day. In the fall, he came out to the hillside and asked Solveig if she would teach him what she knew about earth building, about reading weather, about the things that Burke Voss had taught her father, and her father had prepared her for. She said yes. He turned out to be a better student than she had expected. Old Burke Voss did not make it to another winter. He died in the dugout on an April morning when the snow was finally leaving the south-facing slope and the first prairie grass was showing green in the patches of bare ground near the entrance. He died in his chair, which was where he had always been most at home, with his ruined hands folded in his lap and the pale morning light coming through the small east-facing window across his face. Solveig was with him. She had known for several days that the time was close, and she had not left the dugout, except for necessities, spending the hours reading to him from her father's Norwegian Bible, which he had always said was the only book worth reading twice. He did not say much in those final days. He was a man who had spent 71 years choosing his words carefully, and was not about to change that practice at the end. But on the morning he died, an hour or so before he opened his eyes and looked at her with the full clarity of a man who is very tired but not confused. And he said, "Your father was right about you." She held his hand, the ruined arthritic hand that had once known how to build things, and had given that knowledge to her father, and through her father to her. And she said, "He was right about you too." Burke closed his eyes. An hour later, he was gone. They buried him on the hillside above the dugout, in a spot where the south sun would warm the ground over him in winter, which seemed like something he would have appreciated. Edmund made the headstone from a piece of Dakota limestone, and Solveig told him what to carve. He taught us how to disappear. We learned how to survive. The phrase "smoke from nowhere" entered the language of the Dakota settlers the way certain phrases do not, through any deliberate effort, but because it named something that needed naming, something that people recognized from their own experience the moment they heard it put into words. Any preparation that looks like madness until the moment it is needed. Any provision that seems excessive until the situation arrives that exactly requires it. Any knowledge that appears unnecessary right up until the instant it saves your life. When someone was mocked for their caution, for their stockpiles, for their underground shelters, for their careful reading of weather signs and animal behavior, and the thousand small indicators of what the land was preparing to do, the older settlers would shake their heads with the quiet authority of people who knew something. The mocker did not yet know. "Remember the smoke from nowhere," they would say. "Remember Solveig Aldred." Solveig and Edmund built the expanded homestead that summer, and the next adding chambers, improving systems, developing the techniques that Edmund's carpenter knowledge and Solveig's earth-building knowledge produced between them in combination. They taught what they knew to anyone who came to learn, which turned out to be more people than either of them had expected people from Havenwood and from the surrounding homesteads, and eventually from settlements further out, who had heard about the hillside and the winter and the smoke that had risen through 7 days of the worst storm in a generation. They had 4 children, all of them raised on the same hillside, all of them taught from early childhood the things that mattered in that country: how to read weather, how to work with the land instead of against it, how to build things that would hold under pressure, how to prepare for storms that might never come while living fully in the seasons between them. And every morning, thin and gray and steady against whatever sky the day offered, the smoke rose from the hillside east of Havenwood, not from nowhere now. Everyone knew where it came from, but they kept calling it that anyway because some names are true in ways that outlast the mystery that created them, and because the smoke from nowhere had become, in the end, a name not for a mystery, but for a kind of faith. The faith of a person who does the work before the storm arrives, who builds the shelter before the cold comes, who keeps the fire burning through the darkest and longest nights, not because they are certain it will matter, but because they understand in the way that only certain people come to understand it, that the fire itself is the point. The fire is always the point. And somewhere under a Dakota hillside, in a room where the earth holds its warmth, regardless of what the seasons do, above it the temperature stays the same all year, 55 degrees, give or take. It doesn't matter if it's 40 below outside. The earth remembers summer. It keeps that warmth until summer comes again.